Okay. Yeah, so thanks very much for having us. I guess we're getting off to a bit of a rough start, but it does seem to be very interesting. The topic that Hans-Georg and I are going to discuss today is AI and surveillance. And we're going to be threats to authenticity, bolsters of Profilicity, basically exactly as Sean just. And we can actually already see a lot of this already in Sean's presentation, and I assume the problem the other having is because we go to Everbright in order to, right, which is a third-party service, which would basically just be selling our information to other third-party services, right? So this is all about surveillance. And Sean, you had the photo of the wanderer above the sea of fog, right? And that's normally used in different philosophical representations of authenticity. So discussing, you've already mentioned, or we've already been a part of. So Hans-Georg and I are specialists in philosophy. As you can see on the left, there's just a couple of our books. We think that being specialists in Chinese philosophy has given us a huge to identity in contemporary society because, again, as Sean mentioned, it allows us to work outside the authenticity framework. In Chinese philosophy, both classical and contemporary, authenticity is not referenced. So we're able to approach different modes or forms of identity today without the constant reference to authenticity. So the book on the right, this is what Sean was referencing you in your profile. This is where we look at our concept of profilicity, or express our concept of profilicity, which Sean, you correctly pointed out, has a lot to do with social media and algorithms, but also is very applicable offline. So on the left is one of the papers I wrote about surveillance in China, and then on the right, on the top on the left, and on the top on the right, just a screen grab from one of Hans-Georg's recent videos just from a day ago about Apple. And he has a whole channel where he looks at many different contemporary problems and often approaches them through the lens of profilicity. So we're not specialists really in AI or surveillance, especially the technological side, but we want to comment mainly on the discourses around AI and surveillance. We see there's two main avenues. The first one is that AI and surveillance see too much. And the second worry is that AI and surveillance don't see enough. And we're worried basically not about whatever, something like killer robots. We're worried about our minds being hacked. And this is already happening. It's happening all the time with very simple algorithms using basically big data. So there can be relatively trivial effects. For example, you might buy some things that you didn't really intend to buy, but then there can also be much more negative effects, like you might vote for someone whose interests don't really align with yours, right? Or as we see with filter bubbles, people who have somewhat narrow or extreme views can become even more narrow or more extreme. We worry then about being constantly surveilled without consent. And we also worry that we're manipulated and we can't make our own choices. So, for example, Shoshana Zuboff talks about how we're nudged, tuned, heard, manipulated, or modified. We're also worried that more and more decisions are made for us, and we risk, as Nicholas Carr says, forgetting to make those decisions. We should note that this is an explicit goal of machine learning, basically to automate more and more decisions and to take the humans out of the process, at least to some extent. So what we want then is for humans to have more privacy, and we want humans to be in control and not be controlled. The image on the bottom left expresses the worries that we have. This might be a feedback loop. There might be a lot of different things going on, but anyways, it clearly expresses something negative and that the person is manipulated. The one on the right expresses what most people think the goal should be, right? Which is that AI or algorithms or surveillance gives us some pieces, but we humans ultimately put the puzzle together ourselves. Throughout, the authenticity framework is constantly referenced. Again, just to quote Zuboff and Nicholas. On the other side, then, we also worry that AI and surveillance don't see enough. In other words, there are biases and prejudices baked into the algorithms themselves. Racial biases, economic or class biases. The image on the bottom left is Apple's attempt to deal with some of those biases. And then a lot of times, based on these biases, the algorithms or machine learning or surveillance can get things just plain wrong, right? So the image on the bottom right, that's Amazon's facial recognition technology, I think around 2018, which predicts Oprah Winfrey to be male with a 76.5% accuracy. So there's a lot of sort of real world on the ground problems that many scholars have concentrated on in terms of predictive policing jobs, right? Whether that be getting jobs or keeping your job, various types of insurance, and then social welfares and safety nets. These are all affected by, as we rely more and more on algorithms and surveillance and AI to give us pieces to these puzzles, when certain prejudices and biases are baked in, then we have problems in these areas. So we're worried then about social injustice and discrimination, but also about the loss of individuality and uniqueness. More and more people also want AI and surveillance and algorithms to confer identity on them, but the identity that they want. So Joy Balawami, for example, says, can machines ever view my queens as I view them, right? Or she asks if her grandmother can be seen in the same way that she sees her grandmother by AI. On the bottom left, this is a screen grab from her poem, AI Ain't I a Woman, which is obviously a play on Sojourner Truth's famous Ain't I a Woman speech. And here she asks that AI, and specifically facial recognition technology and surveillance, identify her and other women as Black women, as who they are in terms of how they see themselves. So what we want then, somewhat paradoxically in this discourse, is for race, gender, and identity to be correctly identified and without bias, but we also don't want to be tribalized or grouped. Again, throughout this discourse, then, the authenticity framework is constantly referenced. Virginia Eubanks talks about how surveillance and AI technologies often damage self-determination and undermine free will. Kathy O'Neill, who's probably been the loudest voice in this discourse, writes, with the relentless growth of e-scores, we're batched and bucketed according to secret formulas, some of them fed by portfolios loaded with errors. Errors here just means biases and prejudices baked into the codes themselves. We're viewed not as individuals, but as members of tribes, and we're stuck with that designation. So the basic understanding, right, many of these authors then conclude, as all these quotes show, that AI algorithms and surveillance build profiles of people, and then they use these profiles, and then we make decisions based off of them using these profiles. And there's many different ways that the profiles are referenced, but the basic idea is that profiles are bad, and this is especially true from the perspective of authenticity. Georg?